Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Or at least my copy says Sasquatch. Today's chapter, The Yeti. Let's get started. The Abominable Snowman. The Yeti, or Abominable Snowman, as the press preferred to call it, hit the news headlines in the year 1951. Mountaineer Eric Shipton came back from an expedition to the Himalayas with some photographs that had been taken in the high Himalayan snows. They were of a series of footprints that ran for hundreds of yards across a snowfield. Although the footprints were roughly human in outline, they were enormous. The photographs dominated the British newspapers for days and rapidly spread to other countries. Even if the general public was taken by surprise by these dramatic pictures, mountaineers and old India hands were less shocked. For decades they had been hearing stories about the strange half-man, half-ape beasts that lurked in the mountains. The only surprise was that somebody had finally managed to photograph a series of tracks. The first outsider to hear tales of the strange beasts was the noted hellwalker B. H. Hodgson. He was in northern Nepal in 1825 when his porter saw a tall creature covered with long dark hair, which bounded off in apparent fear. Hodgson did not see the creature himself, but from the description given by his excited porters, he thought it must have been some sort of orangutan. In 1889, Major L. A. Waddell was on a mapping expedition in the mountains of Sikkim when he found a trackway of footprints that seemed to be those of a barefooted man with enormous feet. His local guide declared that they belonged to the hairy wild man, and insisted that they should leave the area at once. Another event took place at around this time, but it did not become public knowledge until the 1920s, when William Knight wrote to the Times about it. Although what he saw was not the Yeti of common imagination, it does give a hint of the wide range of experiences that were attributed to the Abominable Snowman. Knight was riding from Tantok to Sedonchen in Sikkim when he stopped to give his horse a rest and sat down beside a track that ran through the heavily forested mountains. I had a slight sound, and looking round saw some 20 paces away a figure which I now suppose must have been one of the hairy men that the Tibetans called the Abominable Snowman. He was a little under 6 feet high, almost stark naked in that bitter cold. It was the month of November. He was a kind of pale yellow all over, about the colour of a Chinaman, a shock of matted hair on his head, little hair on his face, highly splayed feet, and large, formidable hands. His muscular development in the arms, thighs, legs, back, and chest was terrific. He had in his hand what seemed to me to be some form of primitive bow. He did not see me, but stood there, and I watched for some 5 or 6 minutes. So far as I could make out, he was watching some man or beast far down the hillside. At the end of some 5 minutes, he started off at a run down the hill, and I was impressed with the tremendous speed at which he travelled. It is almost certain that what Knight saw was one of the unfortunate individuals that are driven from their families and villages to live wild and solitary lives in the wilderness. A few of these people are driven out because of crimes they commit, but most are expelled because they suffer from mental health problems. In small, isolated communities, there is no real way to care for those who suffer in such ways, so expelling them to live with the wild beasts is not an unusual recourse. Most of these people die, but a few manage to eke out an existence. it would seem that Knight encountered one such. About 10 years later, Mary MacDonald, the daughter of a colonial officer, was walking through the mountains close to the border with Tibet. She was on a pleasure ramble, lasting a month, and had a team of local porters to carry her tent, cooking equipment, and supplies. As the column was about to enter a narrow defile on the way to the Garbyang Pass, the rocks echoed to a strange call. MacDonald later likened it to the call of a seagull, but very much louder, ending in a throaty roar. Puzzled, MacDonald turned around to ask her guide what animal could make such a noise. She found herself alone. Her guide and porters had thrown down their loads and were running away at high speed, back down the track. Now rather worried, MacDonald retrieved her hunting rifle from one of the abandoned packs, in case the unknown animal turned out to be dangerous, and set off after her porters. She found them grouped on a flat area of ground some 2 miles from the defile. They told her that the cry had been made by Mato Keng Mai, or Bad Man of the Snow, which was warning them to leave. It was only after much persuasion and some threats that MacDonald got her men to retrieve the abandoned packs, but nothing would persuade them to enter the defile. Figures on a mountainside. In September 1921, Colonel Howard Bury was near Lapkala on his way to scout out Mount Everest for a climbing expedition. Suddenly, his porters started chattering excitedly to each other and then began pointing to the side of a mountain half a mile or so ahead. Howard Bury looked for the source of their interest and saw 3 human-like figures walking across a large patch of snow. Some hours later, the expedition reached the snowfield, and he was able to study the tracks left by the figures. Each footprint was over 14 inches long, but otherwise looked like that of a naked human foot. The porters told Howard Bury that the figures were not men, but Mato Keng Mai. It was Howard Bury who translated the phrase Mato Keng Mai as abominable snowman. He passed it on to a Calcutta-based journalist named Henry Newman, who wrote a few pieces about the mystery animal, again calling it the abominable snowman. This was the name that was used when tales of the mystery creature spread through the English-speaking communities of northern India. 4 years later, Nerek Tambazi, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, also chanced upon an abominable snowman. He was studying glaciers in northern Sikkim when he saw a strange figure moving slowly along a path about 2,000 feet below him. The creature was walking upright like a human, but it was covered in dense fur. It stopped every now and then to pluck leaves from bushes and once to uproot a bush and gnaw on its roots. By the later 1920s, several Europeans working in the Himalayas had seen unusual footprints, and many more had heard tales from the locals about the strange creatures. From the various sources, the naturalist Frank Smythe put together a picture of the unknown animal. The abominable snowman was, he thought, an unknown type of ape. The creature stood less than 6 feet tall when upright, but it was much more massive than a human. Its chest, in particular, was very broad and muscular, while its powerful arms hung down almost to its knees. The creature's head had a high-domed skull that Smythe guessed might anchor the strong jaw muscles that would power the teeth when it chewed leaves and twigs. However, its face was rather more human than those of Indian monkeys. The animal's legs were slightly bowed, and its feet were turned inward slightly. Its big toe was separated from the others by a distinct gap that showed up in many footprints when it walked upright, as it normally did. When it was in a hurry, though, it would go down onto all fours. In this posture, it used the knuckles of its hands to support its weight. The creature was said to live in caves high in the mountains, but it came down to the forested valleys to search for food. Smythe discounted some of the stories about the creature as mere folklore. For instance, it was said to count yaks and throw rocks at humans. However, he remained convinced that there was a real creature up in the mountains that was unknown to science. By the later 1930s, this view was becoming more widespread in official circles. They had previously ignored the tales as being mere native superstition, but then the Second World War broke out. Japanese armies appeared on the borders of India, and everyone had more urgent business to worry about than abominable snowmen. Not until Shipton's photographs were taken did the subject again attract attention. It was in the post-war period that the name Yeti began to be given to the strange creature. The word is not, in fact, very accurate because it is derived from Yeti, a generic Nepalese term for any large animal that lives in the high mountains. This has led to some confusion over the years. Locals may refer to the Himalayan red bear, which they specifically call the grizzly, as a Yeti, since it is large and lives in the high mountains. Those who live in the Himalayas are quite right to be nervous of the red bear. It is notoriously bad-tempered. It will attack without warning, and it is strong enough to kill an adult yak with ease. Many later travelers who heard stories about the aggressive Yeti had in fact been listening to tales of encounters with the red bear, the Yeti. One wartime sighting that emerged only after the Shipton photographs were publicized was that of Sławomir Wawicz. Wawicz was a Polish army officer who had been arrested by the Soviet secret police when the Russians occupied eastern Poland in 1939. He had been shipped off to a Siberian slave labor camp, but had escaped and with a few companions had walked south to cross the Himalayas and reach British India. After the war, Wawicz settled in Britain, and in 1956 he wrote a book about his wartime experiences. He included a section on the strange experience he had when following a mountain trek that crossed from Tibet into Bhutan. According to Wawicz, he saw two figures blocking the path at a range of about 100 yards. At first, the refugees took the figures to be bears, standing on their hind legs. They expected them to fall down on all fours, but they never did. The creatures did not stop shuffling around on their hind legs. After more than an hour, Wawicz and his companions decided to retrace their steps and find another path. He claims to have been watching the strange creatures all this time. Wawicz went on to say that the creatures were about 8 feet tall and had squarish heads with no visible ears. The back of their heads was vertical, dropping straight down from the crown, and their shoulders sloped down to a powerful chest. Their arms were long and muscular, reaching down to the knees. Wawicz wrote that the creatures were covered in fur, with what seemed to be a longer coat of hairs over a shorter layer of fur close to the skin. This is an odd description, but if Wawicz is to be believed, he watched these two beasts for over an hour at fairly close range, so he is unlikely to have got much wrong. As Wawicz himself wrote, there was something both of the bear and the ape about their shape. It is unfortunate that parts of the story told by Wawicz turned out to be untrue, so his account of the two Yetis is usually thought to be unreliable. The famous Shipton photograph was the result of a November 1951 reconnaissance trip. Its purpose was to discover routes up the lower sections of the Everest Massif in readiness for a later attempt on the peak itself. Shipton and Michael Ward were exploring the saddle at the top of the Menlung Glacier at around 18,000 feet when they saw a set of tracks left in deep snow. They followed them for about a mile along the edge of the glacier, but then had to turn back. In order to prove their story, they photographed a section of the track and one of the clearest individual prints. 2 years later, John, later Lord Hunt, came across another set of tracks which had been left behind in the snow, but unfortunately he did not have a camera with him to record them. At the same time, he also heard the high-pitched, yelping cry that is usually credited to the Yeti. In 1954, the Daily Mail financed an expedition to the Himalayas. Their aim was to collect information about the Yeti and catch one if possible. The expedition organizers hired 300 porters to carry the equipment up into the high mountains, where hundreds of locals were contacted and vast distances were covered. No Yeti was captured nor even seen, but the expedition did come back with a wealth of anecdotal evidence and a great boost in sales for the newspaper. Among the more exciting discoveries of the expedition was the fact that 2 Yeti scalps were kept in Buddhist monasteries at Pangbosh and Kumjung. They were used in temple rituals and dances by monks who were pretending to be Yetis. The Daily Mail team was allowed to photograph the Pangbosh scalp, but they could not borrow it for study. In 1960, the mountaineer Sir Edmund Hillary was allowed to borrow the Kumjung scalp in return for having the monastic school rebuilt. However, the results of the tests he had carried out were disappointing. The skin seemed to have come from the hide of a suro, a form of wild Himalayan goat. More excitingly, the Pangbosh monastery claimed to have a mummified hand and wrist as well as the scalp. The monastic officials were reluctant to allow Europeans to see the relic, and with good reason, as it turned out. In 1957, an American team was allowed to see it, and another team was given permission to view and photograph it 2 years later. On this later visit, a team member named Peter Byrne reportedly stole a few bones from the wrist and replaced them with human bones. He then wrapped the supposed Yeti hand up so that the replaced bones did not show. Byrne claimed that he handed the bones to the actor James Stewart, who smuggled them back to the United States for him. When the bones were later studied, they turned out to be almost identical to those of a human, but rather larger and more robust than is normal. Meanwhile, the Pangbosh hand was studied by Sir Edmund Hillary, who decided that it was a fake made up of animal and human remains mixed together. If Byrne did steal some bones and replace them with human bones, this would explain Hillary's findings. In 1992, the hand was stolen from the Pangbosh monastery. It has not been seen since and is thought to have vanished into the illegal trade in rare animal artifacts. The Yeti seems to have had a habit of appearing when it was least expected. This appears to be the case in the following instances. Don Rollins was camping on an open slope at 13,000 feet in 1970. It was sometime after dusk on a sparklingly clear moonlit night, and he was resting quietly when he saw something emerge from a patch of nearby woodland. He saw the creature distinctly, and he estimated it to be about as tall as a human, but much bulkier. The beast went bounding across the turf on all fours, moving in a similar manner to a chimpanzee. Only a couple of years later, in 1972, a zoological expedition was camped out in the forested Aran Valley when a large creature came lumbering between the tents after dark. Assuming it to be a bear, the team members stayed in their tents until the creature had gone. When they emerged, they found that their visitor had left tracks that looked similar to those of a gorilla. Then, in 1984, mountaineer David Shepard was near the southern col of Everest when he saw a large, hairy man-like creature following him for a while. It seems that the Yeti is still around because Josh Gates, an American television presenter, discovered and filmed a new Yeti track in December 2007. Each of the footprints was about 11 inches long and 8 inches wide. The sightings by Willens and Shepard are the only occasions on which credible European witnesses have seen a Yeti when visibility has been good. There have, however, been numerous sightings by Sherpas and other hill peoples who spend far more time up in the Himalayas than do Europeans. In the past, these accounts have often been dismissed because the Yeti featured in local ritual and religious custom to such an extent that Europeans did not think that a sighting by a local was reliable. More recently, the sightings have been treated with a bit more consideration. For instance, in March 1951, Lakpa Tenzing went up to the hill pastures above Namche to search for a missing yak. He came across a 5-foot-tall Yeti squatting on a rock and eating a mouse hair. The Yeti quickly scampered off. A few years later, Paseng Nema was leading a caravan over the Nepalese-Tibet border when he saw a Yeti sitting on the grass about 300 yards off the track. The creature was digging in the ground with its fingers, pulling up roots which it then chewed. The following year, in October, Ansering and his wife went up to the high pastures to look for medicinal roots. They emerged from some trees to see a Yeti, apparently picking leaves off a bush. As soon as it became aware of them, it bounded off on all 4 legs, at high speed, to disappear among a jumble of rocks. Another villager, Doc Hu, met a Yeti in rather different circumstances. He was leading a yak and its calf along a track through the dense valley forests when a Yeti emerged suddenly from the undergrowth. The Yeti approached boldly in what Doc Hu took to be an aggressive fashion. Fearing that the beast intended to kill and eat the yak calf, Doc Hu flourished his stick at the Yeti. Recoiling from the threat, the Yeti scampered off into the trees and was seen no more. Meanwhile, a few reports about a creature very similar to the Yeti began to filter out of China. It was said to live on the Chinese side of the Himalayas in the Yunnan province. The first of these to make an impact appeared in the Sunday Telegraph on April 22, 1979, with the heading, "Soldiers Ate a Yeti." Lifted from a Chinese zoological magazine, the story was a third-hand retelling of a news item from 1962. Apparently soldiers patrolling the passes between China and Tibet got hungry and shot a creature that, from the description they later gave it, was some large type of ape. They ate the flesh and threw away the bones, so there was no solid evidence to back up the story. Another report came from 1976. It told of how 6 forestry workers came across a strange, tailless animal covered in red-brown fur. The description seemed to be that of an ape. This report prompted the Chinese Academy of Sciences to send an investigation team to look into the matter. They produced a number of eyewitness reports, plus a few strands of hair collected from the bark of a tree against which one of the mystery animals had been seen to lean. The hairs could not be identified. One of the clearest accounts recorded by the expedition came from Peng Gensheng, a 33-year-old farmer from Kufeng. This was his story. In the summer of 1977, I went to Dade Valley to cut logs. Between 11 a.m. and noon, I ran into a hairy man in the woods. It came closer and I got scared, so I retreated until my back was against a stone cliff, and I could not go any further. The creature came up to about 5 feet from me. I raised my axe, ready to fight for my life. We stood like that, neither of us moving for a long time. Then I groped for a stone and threw it at him. It hit his chest. He uttered several howls and rubbed the spot with his left hand. Then he turned left and leaned against a tree. Then walked away slowly toward the bottom of the valley. He kept making a mumbling sound. He was about 7 feet tall, with shoulders wider than a man's, a sloping forehead, deep-set eyes, and a bulbous nose with slightly upturned nostrils. He had sunken cheeks, ears like a man's but bigger, and round eyes, also bigger than a man's. His jaw jutted out, and he had protruding lips. His front teeth were as wide as a horse's. His eyes were black. His hair was dark brown, and more than a foot long, and it hung loose and long over his shoulders. His face, except for his nose and ears, was covered with short hairs. His arms hung down to below his knees. He had big hands, about half a foot long, with thumbs only slightly separated from the fingers. He did not have a tail. The hair on his body was short. He had thick thighs, shorter than the lower part of his leg. He walked upright, but with his feet apart. His feet were each about a foot long and half that broad, wider at the front and narrow behind. The toes were splayed out. He was a male. I could see that clearly. The picture that emerges from these assorted sightings and other reports is that the Yeti is an ape-like creature that is about 5 feet tall if it stands on its hind feet. It moves habitually on all fours, but it can walk upright for a short distance. The creature seems to be mostly nocturnal, although it will occasionally come out in daylight. It seems to be omnivorous, feeding on plants and on small animals when it can catch them. Most sightings of the Yeti or its footprints are of a solitary animal. It has been speculated that these may be young males, driven out of the family group to find a new territory, which would explain why they are seen at all. A creature in unfamiliar territory is more likely to be spotted than one on its home ground. It also seems to be the case that the usual home of these creatures is not on the high snowy mountains, but in the densely forested valleys. This would make sense, because that is where it would be most likely to find food. However, the existence of an unknown ape species is not the only explanation for the evidence. It is well known that when exposed to bright sunlight, crisp snow can evaporate straight to water vapor, without first forming meltwater. When this happens, any marks in the snow can become enlarged, sometimes quite spectacularly, without there being any obvious signs of melting. It is possible that some of the huge footprints that have been discovered on the high snows have been enlarged in this way. The Back of Beyond. The prime suspects for leaving such tracks are the sadhus, or holy men, who make a habit of living in the most remote places and in conditions of the utmost privation. Their aim is to be free of human interference in their meditations. Some are said to have mastered the practice of tumo, controlling their body temperature at will by the force of mind power. They are said to be able to withstand even the most ferocious winter weather without any trace of frostbite, simply by thinking themselves warm. Another possible suspect is the exceptionally rare subspecies of the Asiatic brown bear that is usually called the Himalayan bear. This is known to be more likely to walk upright on its hind legs than other types of bear. It has been observed doing so for some distance when it has wanted to keep its head high up to observe something. If the Yeti is, in fact, an unrecognized species of ape, then there is no lack of speculation as to what it might be. Back in 1825, the first Western person to learn of the creature thought it was an orangutan. That particular ape is today confined to the islands of Sumatra and Borneo, though it was previously found on nearby mainland Asia. However, it has never been found anywhere near the mountains, nor is it large enough to be a realistic Yeti. Though size apart, it does seem to be a good fit for the cryptid. The fossil record for apes, particularly those in Asia, is notoriously sparse. There are simply very few rocks of the right period to be found in the area. The few fragmentary remains that have turned up, however, show that apes were once far more widely distributed across southern Asia than they are today. During those periods of the recent past, when the world's climate has been considerably warmer than it is now, apes have roamed widely across the area. It is not stretching credulity too much to suggest that a small population of one such species might have been able to survive in the remote forests of the Himalayas. Within this context, the Asian ape mentioned most often is the massive Gigantopithecus, which seems to have become extinct sometime around 150,000 years ago, or perhaps rather more recently. This ape lived across India, Southeast Asia, and southern China. Fossils of the ape are rare and consist only of a handful of teeth and a couple of jaws. So far as the creature can be reconstructed from these sparse remains, it was massive. It was about 9 feet tall if it chose to stand on its hind legs, though it is usually considered to have spent most of its time on 4 legs, like a modern gorilla. Its teeth indicate that it was primarily a vegetarian. It must be admitted that the fossil record for Gigantopithecus, and for Asian apes in general, is so poor that it cannot really be used to prove anything. Gigantopithecus might have become extinct 150,000 years ago, the date of the most recent finds, or it might not have done. It might have been the only big ape with a wide distribution across southern Asia, or there might have been a dozen species wandering about. The Yeti might be descended from any one of these apes, or from none of them. We simply don't know. Whatever the truth behind the Yeti might turn out to be, it is still a popular subject among cryptozoologists. On September 26, 2007, the original print of the Eric Shipton photograph that launched the Yeti into the world's media sold at auction for £3,600. Well, that was very interesting now, wasn't it? Well, that would be all for today. Next time, we're off to South America. I'll see you then. See ya!